The rope swayed in the late afternoon wind, empty and waiting. 3 crossbeams had been erected in the center of Garner's Crossing, Arizona Territory, just off the main thoroughfare where the freight wagons rolled through twice weekly. The gallows stood crude and functional, built from railroad ties discarded by the Southern Pacific crew that had pushed through 6 months prior. A crowd of nearly 200 had gathered, ranchers and their hired men mixing uneasily with townspeople who'd shuttered their businesses for the occasion. Children sat on storefront awnings. Women held parasols against the unforgiving sun. The air smelled of sweat, horse manure, and something darker, the collective anticipation of violence sanctioned by law. At the edge of the crowd, 3 men stood with their hands bound behind their backs, guarded by 6 armed deputies wearing tin stars that caught the light. The condemned wore no hoods. Their faces, sunburned and gaunt from 2 weeks in the territorial jail, remained visible to everyone present. The youngest couldn't have been more than 19. The oldest, a man named Cole Rafferty, stood in the center, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd as if memorizing each one. On the platform beside the gallows, Territorial Judge Harrison Blackwell adjusted his coat and unfolded a document. He was a heavy man, his beard streaked with gray, his reputation built on harsh sentences and expedient trials. Behind him stood Marshal Eugene Cord, appointed by federal authority but beholden to local money. Cord's hand rested on the polished grip of his revolver. He did not look at the condemned men. He looked instead at the crowd, measuring their mood, ensuring compliance. Judge Blackwell began to read. The charges were cattle theft, conspiracy to defraud the Garner Valley Cattle Association, and interference with lawful commerce. The trial had lasted 4 hours. No witnesses had testified on behalf of the accused. The verdict had been unanimous. Blackwell's voice carried across the plaza, formal and dispassionate, each word a nail driven into the finality of the moment. Cole Rafferty did not wait for the judge to finish. "You're hanging the wrong men," he called out, his voice cutting through the recitation. The crowd stirred. Blackwell paused, irritation flickering across his face. Rafferty took a step forward, and the deputies moved to restrain him, but he planted his feet and spoke again, louder this time. "You know damn well we didn't steal those cattle. You know who did, and you know who paid to see us swing instead." Marshal Cord stepped forward. "Shut your mouth, Rafferty. Jacob Garner bought this town," Rafferty continued, his eyes locked on the marshal. "He bought you. He bought that judge. And when the truth comes out, every man standing here today will remember he did nothing to stop it." Someone in the crowd shouted for the hanging to proceed. Others murmured, uneasy. Cord's hand tightened on his revolver, but he did not draw. Blackwell gestured impatiently for the deputies to move the prisoners onto the platform. Rafferty turned his gaze toward a figure standing near the front of the crowd. A tall man in a black duster, his hat pulled low, his face shadowed but unmistakable. The man did not move. He did not speak, but his presence was a weight the entire plaza could feel. "You gave me your word," Rafferty said, his voice dropping, no longer addressing the crowd but the man in black. "You said if they pushed it this far, you'd make it right." The man in the duster remained motionless. Rafferty smiled then, bitter and cold. "Now you'll learn how justice is truly served." The deputies hauled him onto the platform. The nooses were fitted. The youngest of the 3 began to weep. The crowd fell silent. Judge Blackwell raised his hand, and the man in the black duster turned and walked away. Garner's Crossing had not existed 10 years earlier. It had risen from alkaline dust and desperation in the wake of the Southern Pacific's western expansion, a necessary evil where rail met cattle trail, where freight could be loaded and men could be separated from their wages in the saloons that lined Front Street. The town had no charter, no mayor, no democratic pretense. It had a judge appointed by territorial authority, a marshal paid by federal stipend, and a cattle association funded entirely by one man, Jacob Garner. Garner owned 17,000 acres of grazing land stretching from the rail depot to the foothills of the Mogollon Rim. He controlled the water rights to 3 essential creeks. His brand, The Broken G, marked more cattle than any other operation in the territory. He employed 40 riders year-round, men who understood that loyalty to Garner meant steady pay, hot meals, and protection from the law when circumstances required flexibility. He had arrived in Arizona Territory in 1872 with Union Army contacts, railroad capital, and a talent for acquiring land from homesteaders who could not prove their claims or defend their boundaries. By 1884, Garner's Crossing existed because Jacob Garner willed it so. His estate sat 2 miles outside town, a sprawling compound of adobe and timber that resembled a fortress more than a home. A 12-foot wall enclosed the main house, bunkhouses, barns, and storage sheds. Guards patrolled at night. No one entered without invitation. Garner himself rarely appeared in town, preferring to conduct business through intermediaries, Marshal Cord, Judge Blackwell, and his ranch foreman, a former Confederate officer named Silas Drennan. Drennan was the visible hand of Garner's authority. He rode into town twice a week, attended association meetings, settled disputes with cattlemen who grazed land near Garner's boundaries, and ensured that shipments left on schedule. He carried himself with military precision, his uniform replaced by range clothes but his bearing unchanged. Men stepped aside when he walked into the saloon. Bartenders poured his whiskey without asking. He never raised his voice because he never needed to. Opposing Garner's empire was a loose coalition of smaller ranchers, homesteaders, and independent stockmen who had staked claims before the railroad arrived. They called themselves the Garner Valley Free Range Committee, though no one recognized them as legitimate. They met in the back room of the Territorial Hotel, argued over grazing rights and water access, and drafted petitions that went unanswered. Their leadership rotated between 3 men: Thomas Birch, who ran a 200-head operation northeast of town; Samuel Cord, the marshal's younger brother, who had broken from family loyalty to join the homesteaders; and Cole Rafferty, a former Union scout who had mustered out in Arizona and built a modest spread with money saved from federal service. Rafferty was the one Jacob Garner hated most. He was not the largest landowner among the opposition. He did not speak the loudest at their meetings, but he had credibility. He had served with honor. He knew how to organize men, how to read terrain, how to move cattle without leaving tracks. Worse, he had connections to federal authorities in Prescott and Santa Fe, men who remembered his service and would listen if he filed a complaint. Garner had tried to buy him out twice. Rafferty had refused both times. Garner had sent men to intimidate him. Rafferty had run them off his land with a rifle and a warning. That warning had been simple: "I fought for this country. I know what justice looks like. If you push this far enough, someone will make you answer for it." Garner had laughed when Drennan relayed the message. "Justice," he'd said, pouring himself a drink in his study, "is what the man with the most guns decides it is." For months, an uneasy equilibrium had held. The smaller ranchers grazed their cattle, careful to avoid Garner's claimed territory. The Cattle Association controlled the rail contracts, the bank loans, and the judge's docket. Marshal Cord enforced order as defined by the association. Homesteaders filed claims through the Territorial Land Office, and those claims were processed slowly, lost in bureaucracy, or rejected on technicalities. Then, in late summer of 1884, 200 head of Garner's cattle disappeared. They vanished overnight from a grazing range near Antelope Springs, a creek that bordered Rafferty's land. No tracks led away. No carcasses were found. The riders who discovered the loss reported it immediately. Drennan assembled a search party within hours. They rode hard across Rafferty's property, found nothing, and returned to report that the cattle had been driven north into rougher country where tracks would be impossible to follow. Garner did not accept the explanation. He summoned Judge Blackwell and Marshal Cord to his estate that same evening. The meeting lasted less than an hour. When Cord emerged, he carried arrest warrants for Cole Rafferty and 2 of his hands. The charges were specific: theft of livestock, conspiracy to defraud, and interference with lawful commerce. The evidence was circumstantial but sufficient under territorial statute. Blackwell had signed without hesitation. Rafferty was arrested 3 days later while repairing a fence line. His 2 hands, young men named Peter Stokes and James Corwin, were taken into custody at the bunkhouse. All three were jailed without bail. The trial was scheduled for the following week. Word spread quickly. The Free Range Committee convened an emergency meeting. Samuel Cord, the marshal's brother, argued for organizing a legal defense. Thomas Birch wanted to petition the territorial governor. Others spoke of raising money for an appeal. Rafferty, when his lawyer visited the jail, said only one thing: "Send word to Dalton." The lawyer hesitated. "You sure about that?" Rafferty nodded. "He gave me his word. If Garner crossed the line, he'd settle it. Dalton's an outlaw." "So is Garner," Rafferty replied. "Difference is, Dalton keeps his promises." The message was sent, and 3 days before the trial began, a man in a black duster rode into Garner's crossing. His name was not widely known outside certain circles, but within them, it carried weight. Matthew Dalton had ridden with irregular cavalry units during the war, operating behind Confederate lines in Missouri and Arkansas. After Appomattox, he had drifted west, working as a scout, a hired gun, and occasionally as a regulator when disputes turned violent. He did not rob banks or hold up trains. He did not kill for sport, but he had a reputation for settling accounts when formal law failed to deliver justice, and men who knew his history understood that crossing him invited consequences. Rafferty had met him years earlier during a territorial skirmish with Apache raiders. They had fought side by side for 3 days, outnumbered and low on ammunition, and when it ended, Dalton had told him, "You ever need something made right, you send word." Rafferty had never called on that promise. Until now, Dalton rode into Garner's crossing on a gray mare, his black duster dusty from the trail, his hat brim shadowing a face weathered by sun and violence. He carried a Winchester rifle in a saddle scabbard and a Colt revolver holstered low on his right hip. He did not stop at the saloon. He did not check into the hotel. He rode directly to the jail, dismounted, and walked inside. Marshal Cord looked up from his desk. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, then stopped. He knew who Dalton was. Every lawman in the territory knew. "You've got no business here," Cord said. Dalton ignored him. He walked to the cell where Rafferty sat on a narrow bunk, his wrists still bearing rope burns from the arrest. Their eyes met. Rafferty stood. "They're going to hang you," Dalton said quietly. "I know. You want me to stop it?" Rafferty hesitated. "Not the way you're thinking. I want Garner exposed. I want the truth on record. If you start shooting, they'll call it a jailbreak and bury the whole thing." Dalton studied him. "You're asking me to let them kill you. I'm asking you to wait. If they hang me without proof, people will talk. Questions will get asked. Federal investigators will come. Garner's empire will crack. And if it doesn't?" Rafferty's expression hardened. "Then you do what you do best." Cord stood from his desk. "That's enough. Get out, Dalton." Dalton turned slowly. "You know those cattle weren't stolen by Rafferty. I know what the evidence shows. You know Garner's lying." Cord's jaw tightened. "I enforce the law. That's all." "No," Dalton said softly. "You enforce Garner's will. There's a difference." He walked out without another word. The trial proceeded as expected. Judge Blackwell presided with mechanical efficiency. The prosecution presented testimony from Garner's ranch hands who claimed to have seen Rafferty and his men near Antelope Springs the night the cattle disappeared. No physical evidence was introduced. No alternative explanation was entertained. The defense attorney, a young man recently arrived from Denver, argued passionately about the lack of proof, the suspicious timing, the clear financial motive. Garner had to eliminate competition. Blackwell dismissed the arguments as speculation. The jury, composed of townspeople who depended on Garner's business for their livelihoods, deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Sentencing was immediate. Execution by hanging to be carried out in 3 days. Rafferty showed no emotion when the sentence was read. His 2 hands, younger and less hardened, visibly broke. One wept. The other stared at the floor, his face drained of color. That night, Matthew Dalton sat in his hotel room and cleaned his weapons. He did not drink. He did not sleep. He waited. The following morning, a rider arrived at Jacob Garner's estate carrying a message. It was brief, written in careful script on a folded piece of paper. Garner read it in his study while Silas Drennan stood nearby. The message said, "You are hanging innocent men. Stop this or I will stop you." It was unsigned, but Garner knew who had sent it. He crumpled the paper and tossed it into the fireplace. "Dalton?" Drennan asked. Garner nodded. "He's bluffing. He won't risk an open fight with the law. He might not see it as the law." Garner poured himself a drink. "Then he'll learn the same lesson Rafferty's learning. This territory belongs to men who take it and hold it, not to men who whine about fairness. You want me to handle him? I want you to make sure the execution happens on schedule. If Dalton interferes, Cord will deal with him. If he doesn't interfere, he'll leave town like everyone else who realizes they can't win." Drennan left without further questions. That afternoon, Dalton sent a second message. This one was delivered directly to Marshal Cord at the jailhouse. It was even shorter. "You have one chance to do the right thing." Cord crumpled it without reading it aloud to his deputies. He burned it in the stove. On the night before the execution, Dalton visited the Territorial Hotel, where the Free Range Committee had gathered in desperate council. Thomas Birch paced the room, arguing for a last-minute appeal to the territorial governor. Samuel Cord, the marshal's younger brother, sat with his head in his hands, torn between family loyalty and moral conviction. Others debated whether to organize an armed rescue, though none of them had the experience or firepower to attempt it. Dalton stood in the doorway. The room fell silent. "You can't stop this with lawyers or petitions," he said. "Garner owns the system. So what do we do?" Birch demanded. "Let them hang." "No," Dalton replied. "You let them show the territory exactly who they are. Then you hold them accountable." "That's not justice," Samuel Cord said bitterly. "That's revenge." Dalton's gaze was cold and steady. "Sometimes they're the same thing." He left the hotel and returned to his room. He loaded his rifle, checked his revolver, and slept with his boots on. The next day, the gallows were raised. The crowd gathered, and Cole Rafferty spoke his final warning, staring directly at Dalton as the noose was fitted around his neck. "Now you'll learn how justice is truly served." The trapdoor opened. The bodies dropped. The crowd dispersed in uneasy silence, and Matthew Dalton disappeared into the desert. The hangings occurred at 4 o'clock. By nightfall, Garner's Crossing had returned to its routine. The gallows remained standing, a deliberate reminder. The bodies had been cut down and buried in unmarked graves outside the town limits, per territorial regulation. No services were held. No mourners were permitted. Judge Blackwell left on the evening stage to Tucson. Marshal Cord posted notices declaring the matter closed and warning against public disorder. Jacob Garner celebrated with a private dinner at his estate, attended by Silas Drennan, 2 territorial legislators, and the president of the Cattlemen's Association. They drank imported whiskey and discussed expansion plans. Garner proposed purchasing additional grazing land from homesteaders who would now lack leadership or protection. The legislators agreed to fast-track land transfers. Drennan estimated they could consolidate another 5,000 acres within 6 months. No one mentioned Matthew Dalton. He had not interfered. He had not acted. He had simply watched and then vanished. Garner assumed he had left the territory. He was mistaken. Dalton had retreated into the high country north of Garner's Crossing, into the broken terrain of canyons and mesas where Apache war parties had once evaded cavalry patrols. He knew the land. He had scouted it years earlier. He carried enough supplies to last 2 weeks, and he did not intend to need that long. He watched Garner's estate from a ridgeline a mile distant, studying the routines. Guards rotated every 4 hours. Supply wagons arrived on Tuesdays and Fridays. Garner himself rarely left the compound, but Drennan rode into town regularly, always with 2 armed men. The operation was disciplined, but it relied on predictability. Dalton waited 3 days. Then he moved. On the 4th night after the hangings, A fire broke out in one of Garner's storage barns. It started in the hay loft, fed by dry summer heat, and spread rapidly. The alarm bell rang. Men poured from the bunkhouses with buckets. Garner himself emerged from the main house, shouting orders. The fire consumed the barn entirely before it could be controlled. No one was injured, but 3 months' worth of stored grain was destroyed. Garner suspected arson immediately. He ordered Drennan to increase patrols and post sentries at every approach. Drennan complied, doubling the guard shifts and restricting access to the compound. 2 nights later, the main well was poisoned. Not lethally, but enough to make the water undrinkable, forcing Garner's operation to rely on creek water hauled by wagon. It was an inconvenience, but also a message. The fortress could be breached. Garner summoned Marshal Cord to the estate. They met in the study, the door closed, voices raised. Cord insisted he had no evidence of who was responsible. Garner accused him of incompetence. Cord reminded him that federal investigators might take interest if violence escalated. Garner dismissed the concern. "I want Dalton found," Garner said. "We don't even know he's still here," Cord replied. "He's here, and I want him dead." Cord hesitated. "That's outside my authority." Garner leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Then expand your authority, or I'll find someone who will." Cord left without committing. But the next morning, he posted a notice in town. A $500 bounty for information leading to the capture of Matthew Dalton, wanted for arson and sabotage. Dalton saw the notice when he rode into town before dawn, moving through the alleys behind Front Street. He left a third message, this one nailed to the door of the Territorial Hotel where the Free Range Committee met. It said, "Garner wanted justice by rope. Now he'll get it by fire." The message sent panic through the compound. Garner ordered his men to sleep in shifts, fully armed. He moved his personal quarters to an interior room with no windows. Drennan organized armed patrols that circled the estate perimeter every hour. The atmosphere became siege-like, tense and exhausting. On the 7th night, Dalton struck again. This time, he targeted Garner's cattle. He drove 100 head into a narrow canyon and spooked them with rifle shots, sending them into a panicked stampede that left 15 dead and dozens injured. The surviving cattle scattered into rough country, requiring days to recover. The financial loss was significant, but the psychological impact was greater. Garner's men began to fear the darkness, jumping at shadows, firing at movement that turned out to be wind-blown brush. Drennan confronted Garner in the study. "We can't defend against a ghost. He's picking us apart piece by piece." "Then go after him," Garner snapped. "With what? He's one man in 100 square miles of wilderness. We'd need an army." "Then hire one." Drennan shook his head slowly. "You're not hearing me. This isn't about numbers. It's about fear. Your men are starting to believe Dalton can't be stopped." "Then show them he can," Garner said coldly. "Or I'll find someone who will." Drennan organized a hunting party the next morning. 12 men, heavily armed, led by Garner's best trackers. They rode into the high country, following the trail of broken brush and disturbed ground Dalton had left deliberately. The trail led into a narrow canyon with steep walls and limited visibility. Dalton was waiting. The ambush was surgical. He fired from an elevated position, using the canyon walls to amplify the sound, creating the illusion of multiple shooters. The first shot killed the lead tracker. The second wounded a rider's horse, sending it into a panicked rear that threw its rider into the rocks. The others scattered, returning fire blindly, their shots ricocheting off stone. Dalton fired 4 more times, then disappeared into a side ravine before they could locate his position. 3 men were dead. 2 were wounded. The rest retreated in disorder, abandoning their dead where they fell. When they returned to the estate, Drennan found Garner in his study, pouring a drink with shaking hands. "This ends one way," Drennan said quietly. "You give him what he wants, or he kills you." "I don't negotiate with outlaws," Garner replied, his voice brittle. "Then you'd better prepare to die." Garner stared at him, the glass trembling in his grip. Get out. Drennan turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Rafferty was telling the truth. We took those cattle ourselves and sold them in New Mexico. Blamed him so you could seize his land. Garner said nothing. Drennan left the estate that night and did not return. By morning, for more of Garner's men had deserted. The compound felt emptier, quieter, haunted. Garner sat alone in his study, a loaded revolver on the desk, staring at the door. And in the hills above, Matthew Dalton waited for the final reckoning. Jacob Garner did not sleep. He sat in his study through the night, the revolver within reach, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the shutters. The guards who remained on duty moved nervously, their rifles held tight, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond the compound walls. No one spoke. The estate had become a tomb waiting for its occupant to accept the inevitable. Dawn came gray and cold. Garner stood, his joints stiff, his face haggard. He walked to the window and looked out at the empty yard. Smoke still rose from the ruins of the burned barn. The well sat covered and useless. The bunkhouses, once filled with 40 men, now housed fewer than 20, and those who remained did so out of fear rather than loyalty. Fear of Dalton, fear of being caught fleeing, fear of what Garner might do if they abandoned him. A rider approached the main gate just after sunrise. Garner watched from the window as the sentry called out a challenge. The rider halted, raised his hands to show they were empty, and waited. After a tense moment, the gate was opened. The rider dismounted and was escorted to the main house. It was Samuel Cord, the marshal's younger brother. Garner met him in the foyer, the revolver now tucked into his belt. "You've got nerve coming here." Samuel Cord looked exhausted, his clothes dusty, his hat in his hands. "I came to deliver a message." "From who?" "Dalton." Garner's expression hardened. "I don't receive messages from outlaws." "Then you'll die today," Samuel said flatly. "He wanted me to tell you that. He's done with warnings. He's done with striking your property. Tonight, he's coming for you." Garner stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "Why should I believe anything you say?" "Because I was there when Rafferty died. I watched you hang an innocent man, and I've been watching this territory rot under your control for too long." Samuel's voice shook, but he held Garner's gaze. "Dalton gave you a chance to stop this. You ignored him. Now he's going to finish it." "Let him come," Garner said. "I've got 20 armed men and walls around me. He's one man." Samuel shook his head slowly. "You still don't understand. He doesn't need numbers. He's already inside your head. Your men are terrified. Half of them will run the moment shooting starts. The rest will die protecting a man who isn't worth their loyalty." Garner grabbed Samuel by the collar and shoved him toward the door. "Get out. And tell Dalton if he wants me, he can come through the front gate like a man instead of hiding in the hills like a coward." Samuel straightened his coat, his face grim. "I'll tell him, but you should know he won't come through the gate." He left the estate without another word. Garner spent the day fortifying. He ordered the remaining men to barricade the doors, board the windows, and prepare firing positions on the second floor. Ammunition was distributed. Sentries were posted at every corner. He moved furniture to create barricades inside the main house. By mid-afternoon, the compound resembled a fort preparing for siege. Garner stationed himself in the study, the revolver on the desk, a rifle leaning against the wall. He ate nothing. He drank only water. He waited. Night fell. The guards lit torches along the perimeter, casting flickering light against the adobe walls. The air was still, oppressively quiet. An hour passed, then another. At midnight, the first shot rang out. It came from the east wall, a single rifle crack that extinguished one of the torches. The guards fired blindly into the darkness, their muzzle flashes revealing panicked faces. Another shot, this time from the west, dropping a second torch. Garner's men shouted orders, confusion spreading. The perimeter was collapsing into chaos without a visible enemy. Dalton was not attacking the walls. He was dismantling their vision, forcing them to shoot at shadows, wasting ammunition, fraying nerves. A third shot hit the bell tower, ringing the iron and sending the guard there scrambling for cover. Garner ran to the window, peering through a gap in the boards, trying to locate the shooter. He saw nothing but darkness and muzzle flashes from his own panicked men. Then the front gate exploded. Dalton had placed a charge, dynamite stolen from a mining camp weeks earlier, and detonated it remotely. The blast tore the gate from its hinges and sent splinters of wood flying across the yard. 2 guards near the entrance were killed instantly. The others fell back, disoriented, their ears ringing. Through the smoke and debris, Dalton walked into the compound. He carried his rifle in one hand, his revolver in the other. He moved with deliberate calm, firing only when a target presented itself. He shot a guard on the bunkhouse roof. He fired through a window and hit a man reloading behind cover. He advanced toward the main house, each step measured, each shot precise. Garner's men broke. Some fled through the breached gate. Others barricaded themselves in the bunkhouses, refusing to engage. A handful held their positions, firing at Dalton from cover, but their shots went wide. Dalton did not hurry. He reloaded methodically, moved from position to position, and eliminated resistance one man at a time. Inside the main house, Garner stood frozen, the rifle in his shaking hands. He heard the gunfire drawing closer. He heard men screaming. He heard boots on the porch. The door to the study splintered inward. Dalton stepped through, his revolver leveled. Garner raised the rifle, his finger on the trigger. "You'll hang for this." Dalton's expression was unreadable. "Maybe, but you'll die first." Garner fired. The shot went high, punching into the ceiling. Dalton fired once, hitting Garner in the chest. Garner staggered backward, dropping the rifle, his hand clutching the wound. Blood spread across his shirt. He collapsed into his chair, gasping. Dalton lowered his weapon. He stood in the doorway, watching as Garner's breathing became labored, his face pale. "Rafferty told you," Dalton said quietly. "Justice was coming." Garner's mouth moved, but no words came. His eyes dimmed. His hand fell limp. Matthew Dalton walked out of the estate, past the bodies, past the burning wreckage, and disappeared into the night WY morning. Word had spread across Garner's crossing. Jacob Garner was dead. His estate lay in ruins, its gates blown open, its walls scorched, its defenders scattered or slain. No one claimed credit. No one needed to. The entire territory understood what had happened, even if no witness would testify to it. Marshal Eugene Cord arrived at the compound with a federal investigator from Prescott, summoned by telegraph the previous week. They found Garner's body in the study, a single bullet wound through the heart. They found 7 more bodies scattered across the yard and inside the bunkhouses. They found no sign of the attacker, no physical evidence linking anyone to the assault. The investigator interviewed the survivors. None had seen Dalton's face clearly. None could describe him with certainty. Fear and darkness had rendered them unreliable. The investigator filed a report noting that Jacob Garner had been killed during an armed insurrection by unknown assailants, likely in retaliation for contested land disputes. He recommended a formal inquiry into Garner's business practices and his relationship with territorial officials. Marshal Cord submitted his resignation the following day. He left Arizona Territory without explanation and was never seen in Garner's Crossing again. Judge Harrison Blackwell was removed from his position 3 weeks later, after the territorial governor reviewed the trial records and found numerous procedural violations. He returned to Missouri and died of pneumonia within the year. The Garner Valley Cattle Association dissolved. Without Garner's capital, influence, and intimidation, the smaller ranchers reclaimed grazing rights, renegotiated rail contracts, and established a cooperative that distributed profits more equitably. Thomas Birch was elected chairman. Samuel Cord, haunted by his brother's complicity, left the territory and was rumored to have joined a mission in New Mexico, seeking some form of penance. Cole Rafferty's name was quietly cleared. A federal land surveyor, investigating the original theft claims, discovered records showing that Garner's own men had moved the cattle to New Mexico under false bills of sale. The evidence had been buried in association files. It was exhumed, documented, and entered into territorial records. Rafferty was posthumously exonerated. His land was transferred to his sister in Kansas, who sold it to a homesteader family. Matthew Dalton was never found. Wanted posters circulated briefly, describing him as armed and dangerous, offering a reward for information. None came. Sightings were reported from as far as Montana and Texas, all unverified. Some claimed he had crossed into Mexico. Others insisted he had taken a new name and settled quietly on a ranch in Colorado. A few believed he had died in the high country, his body lost to the desert. The truth was simpler. Dalton had done what he came to do. He had delivered justice in the only language men like Garner understood. He had vanished because staying would serve no purpose. He was not a lawman seeking recognition. He was not a vigilante building a reputation. He was simply a man who kept his promises, no matter the cost. Years later, stories circulated among cattle drovers and drifters. They spoke of a man in a black duster who appeared when corruption went unpunished, when law failed, when powerful men believed themselves untouchable. They said he never spoke unless necessary. They said he never killed without cause. They said he left towns quieter, freer, safer. Whether those stories were true or myth, no one could say. The West had a way of turning men into legends, exaggerating deeds, erasing details, transforming blood into folklore. But in Garner's Crossing, where the gallows still stood for another 5 years before being dismantled, where the ruins of Jacob Garner's estate slowly crumbled into the desert, people remembered the truth. They remembered Cole Rafferty standing on the scaffold, his final words echoing across the plaza. "Now you'll learn how justice is truly served." They remembered the silence that followed, the uneasy dispersal of the crowd, the sense that something fundamental had shifted. They remembered that justice, when ignored, would find another way to balance the scales. And they remembered that, in the Arizona Territory of 1884, one man had taken it upon himself to make sure that balance was restored, no matter how many bodies it required, no matter how much blood soaked into the dust. The West was built on violence. It was held together by violence. And when law became indistinguishable from tyranny, violence was the only language left. Matthew Dalton understood that. Cole Rafferty had understood it. And Jacob Garner, in his final moments, had understood it too. The frontier remembered men like Dalton not because they were heroes. It remembered them because they were necessary. Because in a land where justice was bought, sold, and hanged from makeshift gallows, someone had to remind the powerful that no man, no matter how rich or protected, was beyond reach. And so the story lingered, passed from campfire to saloon, from ranch hand to drifter, a warning and a promise carved into the memory of the West. When the law fails, justice finds another way. Always.